content from her lecture. Okay. All right. Brainstem. Start like you don't know anything, because you probably forgot already. We've got a medulla, pons, and midbrain. Right? So we've got medulla. I should start with the midbrain on top, but medulla is down here. Pons is here. Midbrain is here. Let's get a little more detailed. So this is one of the pictures you could see on the lab practical exam. That won't be for the quiz. The quiz will be a cross-section, but this one's one that you can refer to that has some structures on it. Let's take a look at some things here. Let's go top to bottom. This isn't really part of the brainstem, but we'll just talk about them here. Here's A up here. That's the optic nerve. B is the optic chiasm. C is optic tract. That optic tract goes back to some bumps back here. Nope, forgot to do my little thing. Who's supposed to remind me to get bonus points? Too late. Apply to all. Now we got it. So, optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. Optic tract goes to this bump right out here. You actually have, doesn't show it up here, your thalami are right up here. Your thalamus is right up here on both sides. But the thalamus comes all the way down here. That's the lateral geniculate nucleus or body out here. And it's right in this region right here on this side, lateral geniculate body or nucleus. And these should be in that packet I handed out to you the first day of class. Has these with the key, what those structures are. And what I've done is you look at those structures, I've circled the ones you need to know. So that's all. The only ones you need to know for the lab practical are only the ones that I've circled that in that packet that you have, the handout packet of cross sections and external anatomy. This is the mammillary bodies right here. These are all sitting in this area right here called the interpeduncular fossa, the opening between the two cerebral peduncles. That's why it's called the interpeduncular fossa. So if we look at this structure from the outside here, this H, this is the cerebral peduncles. They're basically attaching the cerebrum to the brainstem, cerebral peduncles. That's when we look at it from the outside, the external anatomy, it's called the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. This is one of your oculomotor nerves that's coming out of the interpeduncular fossa. The other oculomotor nerve is not there. So cranial nerve number 3. Trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4, is actually coming from the backside, but you can see it a little. You see it right here. It's hard to see, but it's wrapping right up through here. This is that eye. That's the trochlear nerve coming from the backside of your brainstem. Moving down into the pons, we've got the basilar groove, this region right here in the front of the pons, which is on the basilar pons, this whole front region right here, kind of bulging out, is called, they're referred to as the basilar pons with the basilar groove. Not too much on the pons there. There is here's this L right here. Here's some fibers of the trigeminal nerve coming out here. They got kind of ripped off pretty close to the pons there, but that's the trigeminal nerve. Now let's get down to this pontomedullary junction. The junction between the pons and the medulla, pontomedullary junction. So most medial at that pontomedullary junction, there's 2 cranial nerves, the paired cranial nerves of the abducens. They come out right there. So that's those are cranial nerve number 6, the abducens. And then as we count over, the first one we run into would be cranial nerve number 7, which is this one right here. On this side, it is this one right here. That is your facial nerve. Then the next nerve right here, or combo of nerves, it's a little bit bigger. It's got 2 divisions. It's the vestibulocochlear nerve, okay, cranial nerve number 8. Q right here is actually a combination of 9 and then 10, and then they'll break off from each other out here, 9 and 10. So in the key on that, it just says glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. It just refers those two as in combination. So 9 and 10. Here's a little bit of remnant of 11. Remember, this is spinal accessory nerve. Remember, spinal accessory nerve originates in C1 to C4 and has fibers that contribute to that. And then this goes up into your foramen magnum and then back out to go down to your SCM, upper trap. And then cranial nerve number 12 is, you come one kind of sulci forward. These are coming out of that lateral sulcus. This is this intermediate sulcus here, and there's fibers here. These are fibers here. That's what they're showing T here. That's your hypoglossal nerve. So those hypoglossal nerve fibers, oops. Come on. See the olive right here? The hypoglossal nerve is coming out of this sulcus right there to contribute. And it's kind of covered, in this case you see the olive is right behind it. It's covering up the olive on each side here. That's how you know it has to be that's the only cranial nerve that comes out of that sulcus just there in front of the olive would be the hypoglossal nerve. Okay? This would be the only really brainstem structure like this where I could maybe ask you to point out those specific cranial nerves. So know them on this particular picture right here, this black and white picture. You should know those. Back side of the brainstem. Start up in the, let's start up a little higher actually. This is the thalamus on each side. So those are thalamic structures, and like your third ventricle is right up through here. Okay, is what you're looking at there is the third ventricle between the thalami. Your lateral geniculate bodies are out here. Lateral geniculate bodies for the vision, relay for vision. That's going to go back to your primary visual cortex. So now this gets a little confusing back in this region back here. So this whole region right here gets a little messy. As you can see, lots of bumps back there. You've been exposed to some of these bumps. You've been exposed to these ones right here, these 4 bumps, which are the superior colliculus up here, the inferior colliculus here. That collectively, those are your corpora quadrigemina, those 4 bodies back there. The other bumps you're seeing now back here are these. This H here is actually your medial geniculate body or medial geniculate nucleus. So your lateral geniculate body or nucleus is out here. This is the medial geniculate body. That's the relay it's kind of part of the thalamus, sitting on that thalamus. That's a relay for auditory information that's going to go up to your cortex. So the auditory information is coming into the cochlear nuclei down in this region. It ascends. Remember, there's a lot of bilateral information coming in from your cochlea here. It comes up. Some of it goes to the other side, but some of it goes up through here and some of it goes to your inferior colliculus to register that kind of unconscious hearing that you're going to look towards something, because that's going to use the MLF to drive the neck muscles and the eye muscles to look towards that. But some of it's going to go to the medial geniculate body to go up to your cortex. Okay, and one way it gets there is through, there's this little G right here. This is called the brachium of the inferior colliculus. Some of this information that's going to the inferior colliculus also then gets relayed to the medial geniculate body. Some goes right past it, but any information that's going to eventually get to your conscious is going to go to that medial geniculate body. But this little thing right here is called the brachium. Remember, brachium is arm, and it's just, those are axons running through there from that inferior colliculus up to that medial geniculate body. So it's the brachium of the inferior colliculus. So one more time, superior colliculus on both sides, inferior colliculus just below it. This is vision on top, and auditory on the bottom for more of that reflex looking towards a visual stimulus or an auditory stimulus. This is the medial geniculate body on each side. That's the relay that's going to eventually go to the cortical structures for your primary auditory cortices. And this is this G right here, that's the brachium of the inferior colliculus. Brachium of the inferior colliculus. So that's back in the midbrain. This is the midbrain right here back. Now we're down in the pons, which is kind of cuts off right about there. So what do we got back here? We got the big thing, remember the cerebellum sits back here and we cut it off. And now when we look at the back here of what's left, there is this structure right here. That's this fossa, rhomboid. It's called a rhomboid fossa. It's a depression. It's an opening there. That's actually becomes the floor of your fourth ventricle. Okay, so the fourth ventricle, you have to have a cerebellum to have a fourth ventricle. We pulled the roof of the fourth ventricle is the cerebellum. We pulled the roof of it off. We're looking at the floor of the fourth ventricle there, okay, where some cerebrospinal fluid is. So that's the rhomboid fossa. There is a little bump back here in the rhomboid fossa. There's a bump on each side. This is the facial colliculus. Your facial nerve nucleus is right beneath that. There's a little tiny bump there you can appreciate, but that's the facial colliculus. Kind of like the superior and inferior colliculus from the surface. We call it sometimes it's called peduncle, sometimes it's called a colliculus. In this case, it's called a colliculus, a facial colliculus. Facial nerve nuclei is just below that. Let's look at, when we cut the cerebellum off, we have some distinguishable structures that are called peduncles. Peduncles attach things to things. So we have the superior cerebellar peduncle right here on each side. Then we have, this is the the inferior cerebellar peduncle is this area right here. Then this big thing out here on that is the middle cerebellar peduncle. So K is the superior cerebellar peduncle. L is the middle cerebellar peduncle. They don't even have the inferior cerebellar peduncle labeled on this particular structure. It doesn't mean I couldn't go in and draw in and have an arrow pointing to that, and I could highlight that structure and give it a name or something for the lab practical, or just say identify that structure. On this particular drawing on the other side here, this would be superior cerebellar peduncle right here. This is actually inferior cerebellar. They've got it cut just a little differently here. Inferior cerebellar peduncle and middle cerebellar peduncle. Depending on how nice I'm feeling, I may have them highlighted like that, and I have an arrow going to this one and say, identify that structure. And so I've highlighted, but you should be able to do it even if I didn't have all those diagrammed like that or highlighted. If I'm down in this area right here, you just have to know that seems low and it's not out to the very side, so that's got to be an inferior cerebellar peduncle. If I'm up higher, up here, and it's not out to the side, it's got to be a superior cerebellar peduncle. If it's over to the very side and it's big, it's got to be that middle cerebellar peduncle. All right. I forgot to point out back here, right between where the pons and the medulla is, Here is this little J right here. That's the trochlear nerve coming out of the back side of the brainstem. It's going to wrap around to the front. I would not ask you to identify really cranial nerves from the back side here, even though it shows you some cranial nerves back here. Don't worry about that. Let's get down to this little tip point here of the rhomboid fossa. There's a couple structures here. This little hole right here that eventually goes down and becomes your kind of central canal there. That's called the obex, but you don't have to know that, just a curiosity kind of thing. It's not functionally that important for us. But these things right next to the obex are, so the V right here and W. Those are actually little bumps. V and W are representing little bumps. V is your gracile tubercle. W is your cuneate tubercle. And right deep to those would be that nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus is just deep to that. X is basically representing that structure right there, which is the fasciculus gracilis, going up to that gracile nucleus there. And then Y out here, this is Y, that's representing the fasciculus cuneatus. And I'm trying to remember, I will likely probably have like an area like this highlighted, so I'm not just saying Y, but I'll have this and I'll say, it might say identify Y, but I might have it highlighted like that so you understand that it's in that whole area. I got to go back here for a second. I didn't cover a couple things on the medulla here, a couple major things, just so you're comfortable. Pyramids on each side right here. Olives right here. Right down here is, if I do something like that and have that identified, you see those crosshatch marks, it's a decussation of some type. Crossings, it's a decussation of the pyramids. That would be kind of down in this region right here on this structure. The decussation of the pyramids where the cortical spinal tracts are crossing become the lateral cortical spinal tracts, except for the ones that don't cross and stay on the same side until they get down to their location. Then most of those cross over as the medial cortical spinal tract. Got everything there? Okay. All right, so you guys we've already talked about all these pathways. The vertical tracts of the brainstem, so there's tracts that run either right through the brainstem all the way, or they may run partially through the brainstem and stop. It could be a motor tract that's going to go down to one of those pontine nuclei, then send axon over to the cerebellum. That would be a descending tract that stops in the brainstem, or you could have an ascending tract that's coming up to go to the cerebellum, or go to the raphe nuclei or something to help modulate pain coming up from, and they stop in the brain, or it can go all the way through, like passes like the cortical spinal tracts go right on through the brainstem for the most part to go to their destination. Or you have some sensory pathways that just basically use that brainstem as a conduit. They're going right through. These are the vertical tracts of the brainstem. You can have sensory tracts that pass through the brainstem, motor and autonomic. Okay? So these are the ones that pass through relatively unaltered. The spinal thalamic tract, so bringing up pain and temperature from your body, it goes through the brainstem pretty unaltered. The medial lemniscus, bringing up proprioception from your body, that's going up to your cerebrum to give you conscious proprioception. The sympathetic pathway going from your hypothalamus that goes down to the sympathetic nervous system in your thoracic and upper lumbar spine. That's the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. It kind of goes down through the brainstem, relatively unaltered. And there's also this pathway goes all the way down to the sacral level through the to supply the parasympathetic system. So the DLF, there's a kind of equivalent pathway of the DLF. The dorsal longitudinal fasciculus is for sympathetic, but there's a little couple fibers that go all the way down to supply those parasympathetic cell bodies in S2 to S4. That's also relatively unaltered. And then the cortical spinal tract, the motor tract, the cortical spinal tract is relatively unaltered through there. Things like the spinocerebellar pathway, those are going into the brainstem and then stopping. They're actually going to the cerebellum. That some people consider the cerebellum essentially a functional part of the brainstem. So those spinocerebellar pathways stop at essentially the brainstem level. Cortical bulbar fibers, so if you're going from the cortex down to cranial nerve nuclei to tell them what to do, those are stopping in the brainstem at the cranial nerve nuclei. They're cortical bulbar tracts. Cortical pontine fibers, the fibers that are running along with your cortical spinal tract that stop at the pontine nuclei and then send the copy of the motor message to the cerebellum, those are cortical pontine fibers, and they stop in the brainstem. And then cortical reticular fibers, you do send some cortical fibers down to the reticular formation. Things that influence like limbic system function over, like, say, your respiratory rate and your heart rate and those kind of things. Those are coming from the limbic cortical structures and stopping in the brainstem. Then we have lots of tracts that actually originate in the brainstem. That's where they start, okay? And you've heard them all before. The tectospinal, rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, the cerebello and raphe spinals, which are primarily for either pain modulation or non-specific motor activation, okay? Those are all pathways that influence either sensory or motor output that start in the brainstem. Vertical tracts. So this is showing you some of those. So things that tend to be more motor in nature, vertical tracts that tend to be more motor, will tend to be running in the front of the brainstem, down that front part of the pons, down that front part of the medulla, down the front part of the midbrain, actually all those structures. So things like your rubrospinal tract will start there at the red nucleus, but cortical bulbar tracts, cortical reticular, cortical pontine, and cortical spinal tracts are all running down the front part of your brainstem. Okay? Some stop off in the brainstem, some just continue on down, but they're running towards the front part of your brainstem. So vertical motor pathways tend to be more anterior ventral in the brainstem. Sensory pathways tend to run more posterior in the brainstem, towards the back of the brainstem. That's the main thing I want you to appreciate from that picture, is just some general nature of. So when you have lesions that are more anterior in the brainstem, that can cause pure motor deficits and are more likely to cause motor deficits. If it's in the back of the brainstem, you're likely to have some sensory deficits, but depending on where it is, in relationship to some cranial nerve nuclei that also sit in the back of the brainstem, you can have a mixture of things as far as cranial nerve involvement, but also some sensory involvement, but very little motor involvement possibly in the body, because that stuff is all running mainly towards the front of the brainstem, okay? Have you heard of the syndrome called locked-in syndrome? This is where somebody, typically what they do is they have a stroke, a big stroke in the front of the pons, or in the front of the brain, midbrain, or at the pons midbrain junction, and it basically wipes out all the motor pathways running down the front of your pons and midbrain area, and they have no motion except possibly moving their eyes and blinking, but they're paralyzed in every other aspect of their entire body, even some of their face and everything like that. They might have some eye movement because that's in the midbrain level. This is happening just below usually where the eyes are the oculomotor nuclei are, but it can affect the abducens and all that. But blocking the brainstem function, motor function, but they are totally cognitively aware. They have no cognitive impairment, no sensory impairment, but they can't talk or the only way they can communicate is through blinking or eye movement, and they're totally paralyzed. It's kind of, you think about it, it's kind of one of the scariest things you can have happen to you, is that to be paralyzed to only being able to move your eyes but having perfect consciousness and perfect sensation. And if you're in pain and you feel and you can't move and you're totally relying on other people, but you can't communicate other than through eye movement. And sometimes it takes people, when people are experiencing this, to understand what's happening. They think they might be in a vegetative state, but then they get to, somebody realizes, hey, they're blinking, looks like purposefully to something. Oh crap, they're in there. Let's get the communication board out. Let's get the, and they get the speech therapist, and then they get the little thing where you can look at and follow and then finally learn to communicate. But you can imagine being in that state. That'd be just your worst nightmare, being paralyzed in all aspects and being able to communicate, but feeling totally all you're feeling there. All right, longitudinal sections. So we're going to look at some longitudinal sections to the brainstem. We're going to look at it from this is a sagittal longitudinal section, but then we're going to also look at a frontal longitudinal section. So the basilar section. So kind of this area right through here, this is kind of all considered the basilar section of the brainstem in a sagittal view. Okay, remember I said this is primarily motor. Okay, so these people that locked-in syndrome, they might have a big stroke right in here, and that could cause some of those symptoms. Cortical bulbar, spinal, pontine, and reticular tracts are all running down the front of that. The tegmentum, so this whole region back here is considered the tegmentum. More sensory tracts are back there. That's mostly sensory tracts. If they're running through that brainstem, they're going to be back in that tegmentum. Most of your cranial nerve nuclei lie within that tegmentum. It's just kind of that meaty center of your brainstem. The medial longitudinal fasciculus is in there that connects all those oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nuclei, as well as some of your upper, your vestibulo and reticulospinal tracts for coordinating eye, head, neck movement. That's the MLF is in there. And then what's also in there is the reticular formation. So the reticular formation is actually kind of a subcomponent that's a little more, even more centralized in here is the reticular formation. It is within the tegmentum of the midbrain, of the brainstem. Then there's this thing called the tectum, which is just this area right here. The tectum is the roof of the midbrain. That's just that superior and inferior colliculus, and you only have a tectum in the midbrain. I guess the cerebellum would almost be like the tectum or the roof of the pons and the medulla, but it's not considered that. So now we're going to go in and we're going to dissect out and look at this reticular formation a little more in depth, the center of the tegmentum. But we're going to look at it from also a longitudinal nature, but we're going to look at it from a frontal view. Okay, we're going to divide it into longitudinal zones, looking at it from a frontal or posterior frontal view or coronal view. Okay, it has 3 longitudinal zones. It's a complex neural network in the tegmentum. It has a lateral, medial, and midline longitudinal zones, kind of like the cerebellum has, vermis, paravermis, lateral hemispheres. This has a midline, medial, and lateral longitudinal zones. So we're essentially talking about, this is the reticular formation that's kind of in the center of the brainstem. We're looking at the back of the brainstem here, and you can see it's divided into these 3 zones. That orange thing in the middle is the midline reticular zone. And you come out the little next level of dotted lines here, that is the medial reticular zone, and then come out a little further here, and that's the lateral reticular zone. Okay. And then within those zones, there are some specific nuclei that are lying in those zones that we're going to talk about some of their function, that are not cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, so these aren't cranial. Now there are some cranial nerve nuclei that lie really close to in these areas and are in some of these areas, but we already talked about the function of those cranial nerve nuclei. This is the reticular formation, and it does some different things. It helps modulate activity. It's more of a modulator of overall activity. It doesn't have as much specific control of anything, but modulates cerebral function, modulates some overall excitation of the nervous system. Okay, so going from outside to inside, so starting in the lateral zone out there, there's a lot of integration happening here. So you're integrating sensory and cortical input. So those cortical fibers that stop in the brainstem and sensory fibers that also stop or have collaterals in the brainstem, they happen to do this in the lateral zone, and there's some integration going on there. Okay, that information though is then conveyed to the medial and midline zones to say, hey, let's do something about this. So if you've got a lot of pain coming up from pain receptors, and some of that stops in the brainstem. Okay, some of those spinal thalamic pathway, they don't all go up to your cerebrum. Most of them do, but some of them stop in the brainstem. They'll stop in that lateral zone. Then you're also sending, descending pathways that tell you about movement, and you're moving your limb. That's a painful limb. You integrate some of that information there, and it says, hey, we're having pain with movement, and there's a lot of pain in this region. Let's now tell the raphe spinal tract or the cerebrospinal tract that are in these more medial zones, let's tell them to go send some signals down to the spinal cord and the dorsal horn to inhibit pain. Okay, or down to the anterior horn to modify the movement so that we try to avoid that pain. Does that make sense? So this is happening in kind of some of these regions. There's projections to the cerebrum, cerebellum, and spinal cord from the lateral zone. The other thing it does is it tends to help adjust general levels of neuronal activity and arousal. Okay, it works in conjunction with, this is this general level of neural activity, and the midline zone is adjust general levels of consciousness. And these two things kind of work together to kind of help us with alertness, okay, and attention to our environment. And they help to stimulate the cerebral structures to do that and stay vigilant. These are both part of what's called the reticular activating system. So we're in the reticular formation, right? So there's this area called the reticular activating system, which is in these zones here that work together to allow you to stay alert or stay awake and those kind of things. So if I have a patient who's in a very low state of arousal, you can take advantage of this by understanding that, for example, like when you get vestibular input coming into your brain and brainstem, some of that actually goes right to these centers. There's information coming from the vestibular system into the reticular formation, and particularly to these things that says, if my head all of a sudden comes up to an upright position where you're laying in bed or you're sitting there and you sit up, all of a sudden that tells the reticular formation, start putting dopamine and norepinephrine into my cerebrum. Time to wake up. I'm upright now. I got to fight against gravity. Time to be alert. And that happens because of some of these structures. So if I want a patient to help me in therapy more and participate in therapy more, you want to get them upright. Get them in a sitting position. Don't let them lay in bed while they're doing activity if you want them to be alert. And that's where if I have a patient who's really dependent, that's where co-treatment comes in handy, because I might be working with OT and they just need somebody to help that patient stay sitting so that they can do some kind of an activity like, dressing or self-care activities, and I might be working on keeping the patient upright with good posture, but that's going to allow the reticular activating system to activate and keep them awake. Okay? The medial zone, this is where your respiratory and cardiac centers are in the pons and medulla in the medial zone for vital functions, setting some of that basic cardiac rhythm and respiratory rate and so forth. There's also projections to cranial nerve nuclei and the spinal cord from the medial zone. And the medial zone does influence posture. The reticulospinal tracts are technically in the medial zone. Okay, so they do influence just some basic upright posture via the reticulospinal tracts. Then that midline zone, the midline at very center, that's where the raphe nuclei are. And we've talked about the raphe nuclei and their role in descending pain control modulation. The raphe nuclei send signals. The cerebrospinal tract also contributes to that, and they adjust levels of consciousness. So that's the zones within the reticular formation. Now we're going to talk about some specific reticular nuclei. Those nuclei, I showed you those pictures and circled a couple of them. We're going to talk about some of those specific reticular nuclei that are in there that have specialized function and the neurotransmitters they use. So one of the areas, it's kind of a nuclei, but they call it really an area versus a nuclei, called the ventral tegmental area, the VTA. Okay, so here's the VTA, and I'll kind of highlight it in a cross section here for you in a second. I think. I don't know if I've got a slide. I don't have a slide there. When we get to the cross section through the midbrain, I'll show you where the VTA sort of is. And so the VTA is where there's a collection of dopamine-producing neurons, and it's actually right between kind of the substantia nigra. You have the substantia nigra on each side, and the VTA is kind of right in the middle between the substantia nigras on each side, but it also produces dopamine, but it's not going to the basal ganglia circuitry like the substantia nigra. It projects to, really, this projection here goes all the way and supplies pretty diffuse regions of the cerebral cortex. Then there's another branch that goes down lower here through what's called the medial forebrain bundle. Don't have to know that. And then some of them project to the hippocampus, to the amygdala, and also the nucleus accumbens. Okay, those are really important for reward center stimulation. So, and also your memory associated with that reward stimulus. So, because we have a very powerful reward system set up. If something feels pleasurable or you're rewarded by you got the food, you got the whatever, you want to remember that because you want to experience that again, and you want that for reference for future because that was a successful experience. Let's make sure it's hardwired in there, and that's what that does. But this is also the mechanism. That's ventral tegmental area is the area stimulated by drugs like cocaine, amphetamines, heroin, and those kind of things all stimulate the VTA and reinforce that area of pleasure and reward. And so there's potentially some excessive activity of the VTA with schizophrenia. It's too active. Some antipsychotic medications are used to block D2 dopamine receptors. So the D2 dopamine receptors are blocked, which reduces, if you have an overactive VTA, these are projecting onto, they're releasing neurotransmitter that tends to bind to D2 receptors. But you also, that's why with D2 receptors, when dopamine from the substantia nigra binds to D2 receptors in the basal ganglia, it inhibits the indirect pathway. And so, I mean, it inhibits it excites the indirect pathway, so it can't, or D1s excite the direct pathway, right, and keep you more active. Then D2s inhibit the indirect pathway. But if you have D2 blockage, then the indirect pathway can be a little overactive, and they can have symptoms that are kind of Parkinsonian-like and so forth with some of the antipsychotic medications. The pedunculopontine nucleus, we have mentioned this before because it has a close association with the basal ganglia, but it's sitting in this reticular formation area. The pedunculopontine nucleus, it uses acetylcholine, and it projects some up into the cerebrum and to some of the limbic system structures, but it also projects down the spinal cord to influence vestibulo and reticulospinal tracts and influence postural muscles. And this is where, again, with Parkinson's disease, you get too much, you lose some inhibition, this gets too excited, so the person gets rigid. And that's why you get stiffness in postural and girdle muscles, because the pedunculopontine nucleus becomes overactive. When you lose normal control of the basal ganglia over the pedunculopontine nucleus, you get overactivity of postural and girdle muscles, which just makes your postural girdle muscles kind of stiff. And you get that rigidity. That's what leads to some of the rigidity, is the overactivity of that pedunculopontine nucleus. It's also, though, been suspected that, at least especially in animals that walk on all fours, when you stimulate that pedunculopontine nucleus strongly, it actually induces a primitive stepping, just random stepping, activity. So it plays less of influence over walking in bipeds and people and humans, but it still plays some role in our postural girdle muscles, and it probably helps to assist with some of the central pattern generators in your spinal cord for that stepping processes. The raphe nuclei, so the raphe nuclei are sitting in that midline zone, right? They're in that, and they're showing them in orange here, and that midline zone is orange there. So these raphe nuclei are broken up, and several of them in the midline zones in both the pons and medulla. But some of these project just diffusely. So the ones that are the higher raphe nuclei up higher in the midbrain pons area project to diffuse areas throughout the cerebrum, hippocampus, amygdala. So they're projecting all over and secreting serotonin. Okay, and they may play a role in the onset of sleep, quality of sleep. They play a role in mood modulation, profound effect on mood. They generally modulate overall sensory, motor, and autonomic systems. They just play a modulatory role, ramping them up or down, depending on the situation, depending on the task, and how you're responding to it, and your social, emotional influences over those things. So the raphe nuclei play a role in that. And then also descending pain control via the raphe nuclei that are lower down here in the medulla and lower pons. Those project down to the dorsal horn to inhibit pain at the dorsal horns. Just know general functions of these. They're really kind of a lot of overlapping things, and they're kind of messy, and so big picture, key things on these. I'm not going to get too detailed on these. The locus coeruleus is in the medial reticular zone. Okay, so the locus coeruleus here's locus coeruleus, and then just some of the neurons that are just lying in the medial reticular zone as well have similar functions. They secrete norepinephrine, okay? So they project throughout your brain and spinal cord. They're most active during vigilance and when you need to be alert. But the medial reticular zone and the locus coeruleus that project downwards also modulate pain and help to modulate pain. The locus coeruleus also helps the raphe nuclei do their job more effectively, so the locus coeruleus will kind of prod the raphe nuclei to even do a better job of helping with pain control, so they work in conjunction with each other in collaboration. The medial reticular zone is also help with regulation of the autonomic nervous system. So just know those couple things. And let's talk about this briefly, because we've already talked about all these, but so this is cranial nerve nuclei. What they're showing you here is on the right side, they're showing you sensory related nuclei, okay? And on the left side, these are motor related nuclei. But realize that you have these on both sides, right? So if you'd actually place all these on both sides. So so you can see some, like the vestibular nuclei, they play both a sensory role, information coming in, but then you also have motor tracts, vestibulospinal tracts coming out of the vestibular nuclei that play a role, and so you see them on both sides here. This long nucleus right here that they're showing is a sensory nucleus that goes all the way like this. This is the trigeminal nucleus, and when I showed you the pictures when we were going over the trigeminal nerve and its sensory function, so here's the mesencephalic nucleus is up here, and then the main sensory nucleus is here, and then this lower part is the spinal trigeminal nucleus down here, but they're representing as if it's a continuous structure, which there is probably some connections between those structures. But when I showed you the pictures, before I showed you them as distinct structures, they are distinct areas, but there's actually probably some fibers that connect all those. That's what they're showing here, so I just don't want you to get confused by that. But another reason why that trigeminal nerve is so big, there's just so much afferent fibers going into that. So here's the cochlear nuclei for hearing out here. So we're going to pause there, let you guys take a little break before we dive into the cross sections through these and then go through anatomy, the cross sections. We're going to work our way up through the brainstem, cross sections, look at what's in there, and then we'll talk about lesions to the brainstem. So again, start with big picture with things and know that first before you get into the nitty-gritty. So this is kind of nice. The medulla. The big things that happen in the medulla are this contributes to eye and head movement, coordinates swallowing, and helps regulate cardiovascular, respiratory, and visceral activity. Kind of the big things that are happening in the medulla area, okay? Internal anatomy of the medulla. So we're going to go through cross sections, and so this is showing you on where this, we're going to do horizontal sections, but this is where the horizontal section is through. So we're right through what's called the decussation of the pyramid. So that crossing point of the pyramids, that's one of the common cross sections you would see, is the decussation of the pyramids. So this is what we're seeing here. So we're going to go through the structures on the left and just point them out on the slide here. I think I'll go to yellow here to give a little better contrast. So remember, things in dark here are white matter. Things that are light are actually gray matter, and so it's a reverse image here. So the stain stains myelin, or oligodendrocytes in this case. But so let's go through, let's talk about the nucleus gracilis is one thing we'll see here. And the nucleus gracilis, it's most medial, and it's this area right in here, so that's that lighter colored structure right there is the nucleus gracilis. Okay. We're not quite high enough. The nucleus gracilis, it goes a little bit up and down. It's not just one little point there. It goes up and down. We're not quite high enough. We're not quite seeing the nucleus cuneatus here very well. We might just starting to see a little bit of the nucleus cuneatus in here, okay? But anyway, you're just seeing the barely beginning of the nucleus gracilis. We're still pretty low. We're way down here, so we're not up really near where the really heart of the meat of the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus is up there towards that obex, farther up towards the pons, okay? So here, you know, we're way down here. This is where this is the nucleus gracilis, this is the gracil nucleus and cuneate nucleus that underneath the peduncles there, but the nucleus extends up, and we're catching a little bit of it down here, okay? Then we have the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. So see this area right here, that is the fasciculus gracilis. So those are those proprioceptive fibers, dorsal columns coming up the back part of the brainstem, and they're making connections with the fasciculus cuneatus. I mean the gracil nucleus B as it's going up. Okay, and making some connections there. And then out here, this is the fasciculus cuneatus. E is the spinal tract of cranial nerve number 5. Which we haven't talked about before. F is the spinal nucleus. I'm going to erase some of this old stuff so we don't. So E right here, this darker structure. Remember I said when the trigeminal nerve comes in through it comes into the pons, the pain and temperature fibers descend, and then as they're descending, they're making connections with the nucleus. The fibers that are descending, going down through the pons and into the medulla and even down into this upper part of the spinal cord, as they're making their little connections with that spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, they form a little tract. There's a little tract on the outside of that nucleus as those fibers are running down to make those connections. That's what E is. That's the spinal tract of cranial nerve number 5. F is the actual spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, that lighter structure. G, right here, this area right here is the posterior spinal cerebellar tract. And H, just in front of it, is the anterior spinal cerebellar tract. Those are going to be going up and eventually going into your cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, is where they're going to go and terminate into the inferior cerebellar peduncle. L is that area right here. This is the crossing fibers. This is the pyramidal decussation of the pyramids. The pyramids are right here. So this is the front, this is anterior, front part of your medulla, and this is posterior. And so what's happening is your cortical spinal tract is going down in the pyramids, right? So you got cortical spinal tract fibers descending down here on both sides. Once they get to the decussation, erase some of those decussation fibers here. So you've got these cortical spinal tract fibers descending down on both sides, front of the pons, front of the medulla, in these pyramids right here. Eventually they're going to get somewhere in these pyramids, they're going to go, and they're going to cross over and go back this way to start forming the lateral cortical spinal tract. So we're almost to the spinal cord right here. And so then the lateral cortical spinal tract is going to sit more in that posterior lateral region in the spinal cord. That's how it gets there. It comes down the front part of the brainstem, but once it gets in that low medulla, those fibers, axons, cross over to start forming the lateral cortical spinal tract, which is going to be sitting in that general area, same general area once we turn into the spinal cord. Does that make sense? So those. And then it's happening also on this side. They cross over and go back here, form that. So this crossing point, as they're going to migrate over to their location, then go down, continue going down as the lateral cortical spinal tract, that's the pyramidal decussation. It's that crossing point. And then O in here. This right here, this region, that's the spinal lemniscus. You'll notice we're in the low medulla. We just changed, so we're coming. This is a sensory. This is pain and temperature from your body coming up. And remember, it's the anterolateral system. It's part of the anterolateral system. The spinothalamic tract sits anterior and lateral. Well, right now, as you just transition into the medulla, it's still sitting anterior and lateral. Eventually, we're going to see it migrate back to the back of the brainstem and get right near the medial lemniscus. Okay. We don't have a medial lemniscus yet. We haven't crossed over yet. We haven't had the decussation of the lemniscal decussation is the next cross section we're going to look at. So this is the decussation of the pyramids, lower medulla. Now we're going to be in this region right here, which is kind of mid-medulla, and specifically the decussation of the medial lemniscus. So now we're going to be able to see some structures a little bit more prominently that we didn't see a little lower. So here's the nucleus gracilis. It's huge here. So because we're right in the meat of the nucleus gracilis. We're right up, right there, right through the nucleus gracilis, the meat of the nucleus gracilis here, and also the nucleus cuneatus out here, a right cross-section through that. So that's the nucleus gracilis, the lighter structure. This is the nucleus cuneatus, is this area right here. This is the fasciculus the darker areas, the fasciculus cuneatus, and then this darker area here, B, that's the fasciculus gracilis, and fasciculus cuneatus right there. So these are all fibers that are coming up from, they've come up from below, and they're going to come up in here and make a synapse in these nuclei. And same thing here, they come up, make a synapse here. And then what they're going to do is they're going to project across over to here to start forming your medial lemniscus, and then these fibers will continue going up as part of the medial lemniscus. Does that make sense? And so M right here, these fibers right here, M, those fibers are called the internal arcuate fibers. They're internal, they're in the middle of the brainstem, and they're arcing around like this, okay? The internal, those are the axons that are projecting from the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, the second order sensory neurons that are projecting to go across over and then become your medial lemniscus, then start ascending. And as the medial lemniscus ascends, it kind of twists and moves laterally as it goes up the brainstem. So N is your medial lemniscus on each side. So N is medial lemniscus. And there's a crossing that occurs right there. So these fibers are coming from this side and crossing to become that. Then these fibers are coming from over here. Axons are coming and they're crossing over to get to the other side to form that. And that little crossing point right there, that's the lemniscal decussation. This is the decussation of the medial lemniscus, the lemniscal decussation. Here's our pyramids right here. Those are motor structures, but this is above the decussation of the pyramids, which is down lower where we just were, okay? So this is lemniscal decussation. Let's look for a couple structures we're going to see frequently. The next one here, spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve and the spinal tract. We're going to see that darn structure all the way through the medulla because it goes all the way, it starts in the lower pons and goes all the way down through the medulla. So you're going to see a spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5 and a spinal tract no matter what level you're at in the medulla. It's that long nucleus that goes all the way down to the upper cervical spine. So, and it sits out in this region right here. It just tends to sit in this little bit of a posterior lateral region. So it's on this side, it's this structure, and then this area here. We also have our anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. Posterior spinocerebellar, anterior spinocerebellar. On this side, it'd be here and about there. Those are going up, right, to go into the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's spinocerebellar, unconscious proprioception, right, going up to this, eventually end in the inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay. We just talked about that. So that's the pyramids or pyramidal tract. Okay. Typically, you call that the pyramidal tract. When you look at it in cross-section here, you typically refer to it as the pyramids when you look at it from the front. If you said pyramids, I'd probably be okay with either one of those in this cross-section. There's certain things I'm not too hung up on if you call it pyramid here, but technically it's pyramidal tract when you're in this cross-section, horizontal section versus the outer surface. And then J, here's the spinal lemniscus. That's the pain and temperature from the body. It's our spinothalamic tract, but once it hits the brainstem, it's the spinal lemniscus. It's still sitting anterior and lateral here. This is where the medial lemniscus is. Once we start getting higher up, that's where we start to see the medial lemniscus migrate more posterior and lateral, and we see the spinal lemniscus get closer to the medial lemniscus. So eventually, once we get up into the up the pons and the midbrain especially, they're right near each other because they start to migrate and twist and move up towards each other as you go up the brainstem. Okay, so that's everything there. Now we're here. This cross section is called a mid-olivary cross section. There's the olive, so it's right through the middle of the olives. And we are right in this little junction here where we're going to see lots of cranial nerves in here. So this cross section is probably the most intimidating. Okay. So you're either going to see this cross section. You're either going to see this cross section through the medullary, the decussation of the medial meniscus, or this cross section, or one through the midbrain, which we'll get to. Okay, so hopefully we'll get there in that quiz on Friday. So it'll be either this cross section, the decussation of the medial meniscus, this cross section right here through the mid-olive, or well, there's only one cross section through the midbrain. We'll show you. There's no pons cross section for the quiz on Friday. All right, so we got a pretty good list here to go through. I told you this cross section is, but you know, it's one cross section. You can get it. It doesn't take that long to kind of hammer this out and figure it out. So back here, this is your fourth ventricle. Cerebellum is sitting off the back here. You know, cerebellum sitting back here. Okay. This out here, E right here, that's your inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's basically your anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts together, becoming your inferior cerebellar peduncle that's going to go up into your cerebellum. That's what those lateral protruding, kind of looks like a butterfly, so it's the very edge of the wings of the butterfly, I guess. You want to think of it that way. Next one, spinal trigeminal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5. So that is, G is the nucleus, F is the tract. Because we're still in the medulla. And I said, no matter what, you're going to see the spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5 and its tract, which are the descending fibers that are going down as it's making connections with its nucleus. You're going to see that. And it's sitting posterior and lateral. Just like here, sitting posterior and lateral. But what happened now is these guys, the spinocerebellar tracts, kind of moved out and turned into the cerebellar peduncles. And so you're still seeing it sitting relatively posterior and lateral, but now we've got starting to see the development of the inferior cerebellar peduncles that are now in that position. So it looks like it's more inside, but it's really not. It's just that the cerebellar peduncles are starting to show up. H, this little region right here, that's where the nucleus ambiguus is, which we saw it's used for cranial nerve 9 and 10 for some motor supplies, muscles of the larynx and pharynx, the nucleus ambiguus. Again, it's not really well defined there. Am I going to ask you that probably in a lab practical? Probably less chance of nucleus ambiguous, but if it's circled on your sheet, you should know it, just in case. But it's not for us as functional, PT-wise. I, spinal lemniscus. Here's the spinal lemniscus here. It's out in this region here. So still sitting kind of anterior and lateral. It's not till we get up into that, higher pons and midbrain that we start getting the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus near each other. So this is, again, pain and temperature from the body. It's still sitting anterior and lateral, like as part of the anterolateral system, still sitting out here. Medial lemniscus is still in this arrangement here. In this anterior to posterior arrangement. Remember, it crossed over, now it's still in this anterior to posterior arrangement. in this, and then, but as it starts to move up into the pons, it's going to start twisting and getting more into a medial-lateral arrangement. Right now, it's still in this anterior to posterior position arrangement of the medial lemniscus. So that's our conscious proprioception from our body there. M. M is the hypoglossal nucleus. So that's going to be fibers projecting to the tongue. This is 12th cranial nerve. This is a motor nucleus. And remember when I said that there's a reason when in the brainstem, motor nuclei tend to be more, if they're cranial nerve nuclei, if it's a cranial nerve nucleus, if it's more medial, it tends to be more likely to be a motor nucleus. Because remember, when you're during development of the body, you have in our spinal cord, we have an anterior horn, which is more motor, and a posterior horn, which is more sensory in nature. As the back part of your brainstem opens up, because the cerebellum grows back there and kind of fillets open the back part of your brainstem, and so that the back part of the brainstem gets more medial and lateral, those columns of cells that down in our spinal cord, they're anterior horn and dorsal horn, but now they're cranial nerve nuclei that tend to break up, but they tend to be the more medial nuclei tend to stay, they were more anterior at first, but now because the back of the brainstem fillets open, they're more medial, so it's just more chance that your medial nuclei are going to be more in this region, in this specific region, are going to be more motor in nature. So this is a motor nucleus. And then X, this is the fibers, the hypoglossal nerve, they're going to exit right here. This is the pyramid, and this is the olive. Remember we said that those hypoglossal fibers exit between the pyramid and the olive in that ventro-intermediate sulcus right here. This is the ventrolateral sulcus right here. I'm sorry, the lateral sulcus, and this is the ventro-intermediate sulcus here. And this is the median sulcus or fissure right here in the very front part of the brainstem, of the medulla. N, so again, we're still kind of medial here. N, it's right here and here. That's the dorsal motor nucleus of cranial nerve number 10. And it is motor, I put it in quotes, motor, it's a motor visceral motor. It's driving some parasympathetic control of your visceral structures. It's an efferent drive through the vagus nerve to go drive parasympathetic control of your gut, heart, lungs, those kind of things. So it's coming out, and it's going to be coming out through this region right here in that lateral sulcus there. Dorsal motor nucleus of cranial nerve number 10 is N. P is the solitary nucleus. So now this is kind of the dividing line from out here going this way. Now these structures become all sensory in nature that are sitting out here. Okay, so there's kind of a dividing line because now we're more lateral. These first two medial structures are both motor type structures for cranial nerves, but now we're more lateral, and we get P is the solitary nucleus. In the solitary nucleus, remember, there's like 3 cranial nerves that use that as a sensory structure, okay? And O, this is the solitary tract, which I don't have it listed on here, but I want you to know what that is, because as some of these cranial nerves bring their information in, the solitary nucleus, these nuclei are not just single points. They're elongated in there. They take up some space. There's a little bit of a tract. As these axons come in to communicate and connect with the solitary nucleus, those axons going up or down as they come in appear as a tract. And that's at that little dark area. Those are some axons that are coming in from cranial nerve number 9, 10, 7, that are going to go to the fibers that are going to go to that solitary nucleus. They're bringing in afferent information. That's that O is the solitary tract. But P is the solitary nucleus. Q out here, this is just you got to memorize. Q is a medial vestibular nucleus. R is the inferior vestibular nucleus. S is the accessory cuneate nucleus. T, this whole region right here, this whole region in here, that's all reticular formation that we just talked about, reticular formation. And that is all in, this whole region here is all tegmentum. You know, this is all that tegmentum of the medulla there, and that reticular formation's in the center of that tegmental region, okay? This is kind of that front part, basilar part, front part of the, where the motor system is, okay? The U right here, right at the tip on this side, when the medial lemniscus is in this anterior to posterior arrangement, right here at the tip of that is the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The MLF is right at the tip of the medial lemniscus. And that's that MLF. It's going between the medial longitudinal fasciculus, between those oculomotor nuclei, and also to some of the reticulospinal tracts and vestibulospinal tracts. Okay, so that's MLF right there. And then X, we already showed you the hypoglossal nerves coming out here. Got it? Pons, only have one section through the pons, I think. First of all, big picture, pons. Processes motor information from the cortex and feeds it to the cerebellum. So remember those cortical pontine fibers coming down, they communicate with pontine nuclei that send it to the cerebellum. That's one of the things it does. The pontine cranial nerve nuclei tend to process sensory information from the face via the cranial nerve number 5. That's where it starts in the pons, cranial nerve number 5. Control of muscles of facial expression, the nucleus for cranial nerve number 7 is in the pons. The facial nerve nucleus is in the cranial nerve number 7. Lateral eye movement, so the abducens nucleus, cranial nerve number 6 is in the pons. And then cranial nerve number 7, muscles for chewing, cranial nerve number 5, I should say, not 7, 5, for muscles of mastication via the trigeminal nerve. So those are the main features of the pons. So we're right here, kind of right in this middle of the pons, okay? And we're kind of right where I think we'll see there's some trigeminal nerve fibers that come out generally right in this region here. They clean that off pretty good here on this one. But no, it doesn't show the trigeminal nerve fibers coming in there. We're just a little, this is a little bit higher than that. So this is actually, the trigeminal nerve fibers are coming in just a little bit below this. All right. So here's the fourth ventricle back here. And we are way up here. This is actually a little structure. So the rhomboid fossa is like this. This little membranous structure that covers over this top part, a lot of times they cut that off. That's the superior medullary velum, but that's what we're seeing here, is this structure here that's covering over the top of the fourth ventricle, the very top of the rhomboid fossa there in fourth ventricle. This is that superior medullary velum right here, okay? And then these two big structures right here sitting out, these are your superior cerebellar peduncles. So that's how information is getting out of your cerebellum to go up to your cortex to influence it, okay, primarily through that superior cerebellar peduncle. And that's what you're seeing right here. This is the superior cerebellar peduncles, and we're cutting right through those as they go up. Superior cerebellar peduncle right there and right here. So we're cutting right through those, and we're looking down on top of those cuts. That's what you're seeing here. Okay, the superior cerebellar peduncle. Oh, D. Good old D. It's this little guy right here. And it's on this side here. D is this little area right here and right here. That's the mesencephalic nucleus of cranial nerve number 5. a little tiny mesencephalic nucleus. It's the bottom of the mesencephalic nucleus because we're still in the pons. Remember, the mesencephalic nucleus is primarily up in the midbrain as the mesencephalon. But remember that picture I showed you where it showed that spinal, the trigeminal nerve nucleus as a continuous structure? Well, this is the continuation, the bridge between the main sensory nucleus up to the mesencephalic nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, is this little area right in here, okay? And C is the little track that goes along with it, that goes up, and the axon's running up to make connections to that mesencephalic nucleus. And remember, the mesencephalic nucleus is just the proprioceptive information coming from the TMJ to go up there, that little tip of that nucleus up there. So that's why even though we're not in the mesencephalon yet, it starts a little bit lower. These structures are all, elongated a little bit and cover territory, superior to inferior. Oh, E, medial longitudinal fasciculus, right here. You're going to see that medial longitudinal fasciculus tends to stay posterior and really close together midline throughout any of these cross sections. You're going to see, if you see the MLF, it's going to tend to be more posterior here and really close to midline because they're running right together to connect all those brainstem nuclei, those oculomotor nuclei, and abducens and trochlear and all that stuff. Okay. Already showed you superior cerebral peduncle. K, here's the spinal lemniscus now. And then L and M together, that's the medial lemniscus. So now you'll note the medial lemniscus, down lower, it was in that, down the last cross section, it was down in the anterior to posterior arrangement. Well, what it did is it moved posterior and it twisted into this position as we went up the brainstem. From that medulla up into the pons, it just twisted into that position. And remember that spinal lemniscus was sitting out here more in the posterior lateral region, although this big basilar pons got added on. It migrated a little bit back and now is joined up with the medial lemniscus. Once we get into this pons, it kind of moved to that location. So that's the spinal lemniscus. So once we're in the pons, everything's together. As far as this is conscious proprioception and conscious pain and temperature from the body are all near each other once we get up into the pons. And then you start to send information from some of your information from your trigeminal nucleus, whether it's from your main sensory nucleus or from your spinal nucleus or trigeminal nerve. That starts to go, it crosses over and starts to go up to go to your cortex to give you conscious awareness. And there's a little section right back here that's essentially kind of now right next to the medial lemniscus and is the trigeminal lemniscus. The trigeminal lemniscus is got now sensory information from the face that's been processed on the other side. Once it's crossed over, now it's ascending with those to go up to the facial region for sensory conscious awareness of sensory information. That's what the trigeminal lemniscus is. And then P is the pyramidal tract and cortical pontine fibers. So P, all the dark stuff, these are axons. These are white matter fibers. These are your cortical spinal tract fibers that are running down that are eventually going to go into your pyramids, right? They're becoming your pyramids in your medulla. But some of them stop here and then communicate with the pontine nucleus, which the pontine nuclei are all the little white areas here. And so if you have tracts coming down, so this is a tract coming down through here, some of these will go all the way down into your pyramids and then cross over to the other side, the decussation of the pyramids as your cortical spinal tracts. Some will just stop right here and communicate with the pontine nucleus, which the pontine nucleus crosses over and you don't see it here. It would have to dive down further into the middle cerebellar peduncle to go to the cerebellum on the opposite side via the pontine nucleus and the cortico. This would be these fibers that stop in the pons are called cortical pontine fibers, but they're running right along with your cortical spinal fibers that pass all the way through the pons. Okay, so the stops in the pons is called a cortical pontine fiber. And then it communicates with a pontine nuclei that has an axon that projects across and goes to the opposite side of the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncle. But this is all review to you guys. You guys know this stuff. I should just not even talk about this stuff. So that's not as many things in the pons there to be aware of. A few. Now we're moving into the midbrain. And only one section to the midbrain. So this is the other one you can see on the quiz. So talk about functions in the midbrain. Eye movement, your oculomotor nucleus, cranial nerve number 3 is there. The relays for reflexive eye and head movements associated with visual and auditory information, because you have the tectum there, that's the superior and inferior colliculi that make that up. Your pupillary, consensual, and accommodation reflexes are regulated at the midbrain level. Dopamine for the basal ganglia circuit to the substantia nigra. Upper extremity movement via the red nucleus. Some locomotion and postural influences via the pedunculopontine nucleus. Starts there. And then some pain suppression via the periaqueductal gray. That's the periaqueductal gray is that area right around the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain. So there's a lot that goes on in the midbrain for how kind of small the region kind of is compared to some of the other things. So we are doing a cross-section through here, through the superior colliculus is the cross-section. That's the only cross-section you'll see. Have to know. So here it is. A, these two bumps back here, that's your superior colliculus. Both sides there. C, there's not one on this side, but it just probably got torn off. This is the medial geniculate nucleus. You don't need to really worry about it, but just point that out because you'll wonder what that bump is over there and why there's not one on this side. It just must have got torn off. But that's the medial geniculate nucleus. This is actually, this B right here is likely the brachium of the inferior colliculus coming up to the medial geniculate body there, is what you're seeing there from the inferior colliculus, which is, we're at the level of superior colliculus, so it's below that, projecting up to that medial geniculate body. And the lateral geniculate body be out a little more lateral. They just don't see it there because that's on the back of the thalamus. We're probably seeing, yeah, you'll see right here, if we look back here, the medial geniculate body is right here, and this is the brachium of the inferior colliculus right here. So we're seeing that cross-section and picking up that medial geniculate body and some of those fibers, the brachium of the inferior colliculus right here coming up to that medial geniculate body. D, reticular formation. In the brain, midbrain, this whole region in here is all considered reticular formation. And that's where we can divide that into like longitudinal zones. The ventral tegmental area is actually kind of in this region here, the ventral tegmental area. Not so much right here where the red nucleuses are, but that's generally where the ventral tegmental area that has dopamine projecting cells that go up to the front part of your brain, that reward center and so forth. But this doesn't talk about it in here, and I had to actually do a little searching to find where that actual ventral tegmental area, you hear about it all the time, but nobody highlights it very well. But you don't have to know that because it's not on the list here. So, E, spinal lemniscus. So here's the spinal lemniscus. And then F and G together, this is the medial lemniscus. So you remember back here, this spinal lemniscus, medial lemniscus, and all that are all right here together, and they're lined up pretty much in this medial to lateral position. Well, as you go up into the midbrain, it continues to twist a little bit. Well, twists like this into this position. So now the medial lemniscus is here, and you're starting now to get into more of an anterior-posterior arrangement again of those structures. So right here, so spinal lemniscus right here. They don't show the trigeminal lemniscus. Sometimes it gets a little more incorporated by the time it gets up in here, but it'd probably be in this region right here. But it's getting incorporated with those spinal and medial lemnisci. H and T, this is the substantia nigra, which is light colored on this type of a stained cross section because those are cell bodies. So we think of the substantia nigra, when you look at it in a true cross section, it's dark. It's got this dark tint to it because it's got melanin stained nuclei. Well, that when you do the cross sectioning here and the staining here, the stain actually binds to the white matter, the axons. This is your crus cerebri. This is your cortical spinal tract fibers running down the front part here. That's why they're dark, but the substantia nigra is actually light in this because it's cell bodies, and they don't get stained. Okay, so substantia nigra. Red nucleus is pretty obvious. This nice big structure here, K on each side, for the start of the cerebrospinal tract. N is the cerebral aqueduct, that little cerebrospinal fluid's running between the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. O is the periaqueductal gray matter. Plays a role in descending pain control. Okay, we have cell bodies in here that project down to your dorsal horn. Some of those project to the raphe nuclei as well to enhance their function. But anyway, that's a periaqueductal gray. P, you have one on each side. There and there. Here's the periaqueductal gray, and it's right there and there on each side. That's the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. That's the parasympathetic fibers that go out for your pupillary constriction, that help for pupillary constriction. That's where those start or originate. And they are in the oculomotor nerve. They join up with the oculomotor nerve, which is Q, right here. Oculomotor nerve is right there. And then your oculomotor nerve fibers, which contain the fibers for moving the eyes and also the parasympathetic fibers that are going to constrict the pupil, they exit right here. This is that interpeduncular fossa. This is that space opening here, interpeduncular fossa. They exit out like that. MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, this is where it starts, essentially. The MLF starts right here, and it's this tiny little structure here and here. It's still, it's still in this general region where it's more kind of in the middle of the brainstem here and more very midline in nature. But the MLF, that's kind of where, that's the last point it stops, is up at that oculomotor nucleus. That's the highest cranial nerve nuclei that it has to help coordinate. And then it runs all the way down to your abducens or trochlear nucleus and abducens nucleus, and then also down to your vestibular and reticulospinal tracts for controlling upper back and neck. That's the medial longitudinal fasciculus. S, I showed you, is the oculomotor nerve fibers coming out there. How we doing? It's a lot, I know. You can handle it. It's just spending time covering over the sheet, looking at it, redoing it. It'll start to make sense, and you start to see the structures. Kind of think about where you're at, following how those things move, so you're not having to memorize everything specifically. Know regions and say this is where it's likely to be. This is probably likely more a sensory versus motor area, and I can kind of reason this out if you got a multiple choice question or something, or however you will have to identify those and write these out in the lab practical. Where you have to. Let's get through a couple disorders of the brainstem. We may not get through all of them, but in general, when you have some type of a disorder or lesion in the brainstem, tumor, stroke, whatever, you will likely have at least one of the 4Ds. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time you'll have one of these 4Ds. You'll have trouble swallowing, you'll have double vision, you'll have ataxia or incoordination, and you also likely will have difficulty with speaking because it'll be hard because your muscles in your mouth will be maybe weak. You know your brain's okay and you know what words you're supposed to say, but they'll just sound slurred and you might be slobbering because your muscles are weak. So the weakness in your muscles that are because of cranial nerve problems, if you have damage in your brainstem somewhere, there's a chance you could damage one of the cranial nerves that controls your throat and your mouth, your tongue, right? Vagus, glossopharyngeal, facial nerve, hypoglossal nerve. You damage any of those nerves, it's going to affect how you swallow, talk, how your face may look. You're going to have some dysarthria, dysphagia possibly. If you affect any of the MLF or any of the abducens, trochlear, oculomotor nuclei, there's a chance you're going to have double vision, especially early on after the injury, because your eyes aren't just going to work together right. They're going to be not lined up right. If you have any damage to any of the connections between your cerebellum and your brainstem, anywhere in your brain, it's going to cause some incoordination. And there's a good chance damage almost anywhere in the brainstem could lead to incoordination because you could catch some of those fibers. So that's why the 4Ds are critical to kind of be aware of that could signify brainstem lesions. The other thing is that disassociated sensory loss, or where you have loss of sensation on one side of your face and the opposite side of your body. That's another key indicator of brainstem dysfunction. So you could add maybe a fifth D, disassociated sensory loss, face, body, opposite sides. That's another key indicator that you're in the brainstem. You've got a brainstem type lesion. Other common manifestations of brainstem dysfunction, vital functions. These people may have really hard difficulty regulating blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, those kind of things, because you damage any of the respiratory and cardiac centers in the medulla and pons. You damage the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus going down to the sympathetic control. You're going to have regulation of autonomic function problems. Disorders of consciousness, that reticular activating system that helps you stay alert and aware, if you damage that, people have brainstem lesions, they have very difficulty time staying alert and awake and so forth. And I just mentioned the contralateral, ipsilateral signs. So if you have got this, signs and symptoms that's that disassociated kind of sense. Typically it's more sensory in nature than it would be more motor nature. But all right, specific brainstem syndromes and lesions. The first one is called medial medullary syndrome. So I'm giving you these a little bit more easy to follow diagrams that are similar to the cross sections you saw, but more highlighted and just easier black and white diagrams here. So medial medullary syndrome, this is where you have basically, you wipe out this region of your brainstem. It's mainly due to damage to the anterior spinal artery. Somebody has an anterior spinal artery stroke or damage, or the branches that come off of that, that's where they can have this medial medullary syndrome. And so this happens in the medulla, and what you'll tend to see with this is contralateral hemiplegia, because you've damaged, this is the pyramid, this is the pyramidal tracts, the cortical spinal tract fibers running down, but you're up here. The damage typically occurs before the crossing or the decussation of the pyramids, because that's going to happen down here, lower. This is up and a little bit higher up in the medulla here. The damage is occurring here, so it's going to cause, the lesion here is on the left. This is a left-sided lesion. It's going to cause right-sided or contralateral hemiplegia. And it can affect the whole body. Okay. Then we have contralateral loss of position sense, because it happens to also affect the medial lemniscus. Remember, the medial lemniscus in this region is oriented in this anterior to posterior direction, but it's all crossed over already. It crossed over at that decussation of the medial lemniscus lower down, it crossed over, and now, so if you damage this, you have contralateral loss of proprioception with this. Then the other primary thing you'll have is ipsilateral deviation of the tongue. Here's the hypoglossal nucleus, hypoglossal nerve. The fibers project through this area, and it tends to catch some of the hypoglossal nerve fibers. And so the lesion is on the left. The hypoglossal nerve fibers are going to the left side of your tongue, so your left side of your tongue is weak. And so when you tell the person to stick their tongue out, the muscles on the right side will push out and push it towards the left, because your weak left ones don't balance it out, so it'll deviate to the left, to the same side as the lesion. So that's why it's called ipsilateral. It's ipsilaterally, it's deviating to the same side as the lesion, ipsilateral to the lesion. So the damage is in the brainstem, it's going to deviate towards that same weak side, okay? Ipsilateral deviation of the tongue. That's medial medullary syndrome. All right. This one's kind of messy, but this is the most common. So this is the one you probably want to spend the most time making sure you feel comfortable with. It's called lateral medullary syndrome. They also called Wallenberg syndrome. If you read a patient's chart and it says Wallenberg syndrome, this is what's just a lateral medullary syndrome. It's more common. It involves blockage or damage to the posterior inferior cerebral artery, posterior inferior cerebral artery. And actually, that's the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And when we get to the blood supply, you'll see why it supplies that region specifically, this lateral part of the medulla. All right, so that's the kind of general region that supplies. So you knock that part of your medulla out on one side. Here's what you're going to have. You're going to have contralateral loss of pain and temperature from the body via the spinothalamic tract. So this is the spinothalamic tract here, this eye right here. That's the spinal lemniscus. That's pain and temperature coming from the opposite side of the body. We're up in the medulla, that's all crossed over. That stuff crossed over in the spinal cord, so it's going to cause contralateral loss of pain and temperature. Ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature from the face. This is the spinal nucleus and tract of trigeminal nerve. So information came in just above this, above in the pons. It's coming down and making connections, but it's getting blocked. So you're blocking pain and temperature coming in from the same side of the face as the lesion. So the lesions, in this case, the lesion is on the right, and the loss of pain and temperature for the face would be on the right, but we have loss of pain and temperature from the opposite side of the body. So this is that dissociated sensory loss. What's interesting, though, is look, the medial lemniscus, which is right here, these people have normal proprioception. Their proprioception is not being affected. It's just pain and temperature from the face and body, but opposite sides of the face and body. They will often have some dysphagia and hoarseness and a gag reflex problem, possibly some dysarthria, because you damage the nucleus ambiguus. Okay. So that's this area here, nucleus ambiguous. But you also might catch, dorsal motor nucleus vagus back here a little bit. Okay. Those are contributing to some of those cranial nerve number 9 and 10 that go to supply muscles of the throat, larynx, and pharynx. So if you damage, and you also damage the actual fibers, the axons projecting to come out in that region to form those nerves. And so they'll have some dysphagia, hoarseness, and so forth. Because you also affect some of the vestibular nuclei, okay, so really kind of Q and R right here, the two vestibular nuclei that you're affecting, but this side here, Q and R would be here, you're going to possibly have some nausea, vertigo, and dizziness, because that's where some of your vestibular information from your inner ear is going. And one of its first stops is at that area, and that will make you feel like you can't process that information and make you feel potentially dizzy and vertiginous, and that will elicit often some nausea as well. They'll actually also tend to actually fall towards that side of the lesion. You know, you'll get them up, they'll feel kind of dizzy and nauseous, and then also as they walk, they'll tend to walk and drift and fall to that side of the lesion as well. They will have ipsilateral ataxia. So ipsilateral ataxia, because you damage the inferior cerebellar peduncle on that side. So that's the spinal cerebellar tracts that are trying to get up to the cerebellum and tell it what's happening in your unconscious proprioceptive systems, and it can't get there, so you're not getting good information to your cerebellum about what's happening, so you will look uncoordinated. You know, you have incoordination on that side of your body. And that's everything. That's leg and arm and everything coming up through that inferior cerebellar peduncle. The other thing they're going to have is called ipsilateral Horner syndrome. Horner syndrome is a characteristic syndrome when you damage the DLF, the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, which is a tiny little tract. This is the tract going from hypothalamus down to your sympathetic nervous system. And it's in this region in the brainstem, somewhere in this tegmentum. You know, it's somewhere in this region here, the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. They don't even show it. It's not identifiable that there are fibers that are going down to communicate with your sympathetic neurons in your thoracic and lumbar spine that are coming from your hypothalamus, running down through that tegmentum of the brainstem all the way through. So you will see this Horner syndrome pop up a couple times on these lesions. Anytime you damage this tegmental region, you might catch that dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, and it'll give you a Horner syndrome, which we'll show you what a Horner syndrome here is in a second. So here's the Horner syndrome. So here's your hypothalamus right here. And here's that DLF, dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, runs down all the way down to your upper thoracic area and goes down and supplies and helps modulate sympathetic control of that sympathetic outflow at the spinal cord level. Specifically, it also regulates the sympathetic fibers that from the upper thoracic region that then project up to supply the sympathetic control of your face and your eye and your head, right? You got to supply the sweat glands, you got to supply the vessels, you got to supply your eye with sympathetic control. But there is no sympathetic fibers that come out of your cranial nerves. The way they get up there is the sympathetic comes up from the upper thoracic region through this little chain of cervical ganglia that come up to go up to your face and head. If you damage this pathway, you can get loss of sympathetic, you can get sympathetic discontrol going up to your face, eye, and head, okay? So it causes this kind of thing where you have, this is somebody who's got some Horner syndrome on the left side here. So he's got a droopy eyelid because there's actually a little bit of sympathetic control over a few muscles that help elevate the eyelid. So he's got a little bit of a droopy eyelid. He's got a constricted pupil because he's lost the sympathetic dilation balance. And so now he's overly influenced by just the parasympathetic fibers coming out of that Edinger-Westphal nucleus. And so you see this is what his normal eyeball should look like given the light in the room. There's a mismatch there. So we've got a constricted pupil, we've got a slightly depressed eyelid, okay? And then this is the Mueller's muscle, I think. There's a few fibers right here that helps elevate your eyelid. Because the other thing that helps elevate your eyelid is also oculomotor nerve, but this is a little different. This is the sympathetic control of a few fibers that help to elevate, so you don't see a big drastic drop in the eyelid, just a small drop. But then they also lose some sympathetic control over the face. They'll actually get a little bit redder on this side of the face, because normally sympathetic maintains some vasoconstriction in your skin. It keeps your vessels slightly vasoconstricted, so they get too vasodilated, so their face gets a little bit more flushed on one side. Okay, so that's the kind of this Horner syndrome is. And then they also lack the ability to sweat on that side of their face because your sympathetic nervous system drives your sweat glands. So they have lack of sweating on one side of their face. They have some flushing of the skin. They have this constricted pupil on one side, a slightly depressed eyelid on that side. That constellation of symptoms is called Horner syndrome. And when you walk in, somebody walks into the room and you see that, it's immediate. Like if you've seen it a few times, you're like, this person has Horner syndrome. They've got a problem with their brainstem somewhere. They've got the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus has been impacted in some way that can cause, although you can get, like there's some cancers, the upper part of your lung that can affect that superior cervical ganglion, and that connection can cause Horner syndrome too. So that's what that is. You can actually have Horner syndrome in animals too. This is actually a dog with Horner syndrome. It's on this side here, and their eyelid comes up. So the eyelid is depressed in a sense, but it's because the eyelid comes up. It's up this way. That's the way you see that. And then if you were to pull that out of the way, you see how big this pupil is. You can tell that that pupil in there is going to be much smaller. So it doesn't just happen in humans. The animals have a dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. So we are going to stop right there. We actually got through a little more than I thought we would today, so that's good.